Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I started on what will likely be the final tombstone for this year's haunt, and instead of a typical build video, I thought I'd share with you my design process. Now rather than have you watch me push pixels around on screen, I tried to break it into sections to explain my thought process and things you'll want to consider when coming up with your own design. So let's get into it. Whenever I'm designing epitaphs, I always start by figuring out just how much text I'll need to design for. In the case of this tombstone, it's going to be the last one I'll make for our haunt, so I'll start with the Van Oak's surname, the year our haunt started, and the year it will end. Now there's a bunch of different information that could go on a tombstone, everything from who the person was, what relation they had to other people like mother or father, their age when they died, or even how they met their end. This helps to add to the backstory and grounds it a bit more in reality. For this tombstone, I found a quote about the passing of time that I liked, and so I added it to the layout and adjusted the spacing and balanced out the text so that it was pleasing to the eye. I'm not spending a lot of time on this at this point because it could all change once I determine what fonts I want to use. So this is just to help give a general feel for the amount of text I'll need to design around. As any haunter will tell you, tombstones come in all shapes and sizes. I like to keep a folder of various tombstones that have caught my eye for one reason or another, so that I can use it as a reference in the creation of tombstones for our haunt. These photos capture everything from size, shape, placement of text and other elements, all the way down to textures and colors. So if you're looking to create a realistic cemetery, having good references is an absolute must. And after looking at a bunch of options, there was one that really stood out to me. It had plenty of room for my epitaph and wouldn't look like anything else in our haunt, so that's what I'll go with. And because the shape I've chosen will allow for plenty of text, I can continue with the basic layout that I started with, but I'll need a better font, which is easier said than done. There are quite literally hundreds of thousands of fonts to choose from. But when selecting a font for a tombstone, I'm considering three main things. 1. Does it seem era-correct or stylistically appropriate? For example, you wouldn't want a tombstone that dates back into the 1800s written in Comic Sans. Come to think of it, you never want anything written in Comic Sans. So I'm looking for a serif font, since that fits stylistically. And the second consideration, I'm looking for something that is bold enough to be easy to carve, paint, and read. Fonts that are too small or thin will rarely look as intended and can be really challenging to carve cleanly, especially if you're using a larger carving bit on your rotary tool. The third thing I'm looking for are fonts that don't have tiny details that would potentially break off during the carving or painting process, like the insides of the letters A or E. So this Bookman Pro font that I've landed on will be just right for this tombstone. Now, if you don't have an unreasonably large collection of fonts like I do, and you're looking for an easy way to see a bunch of free font options at one time, websites like dafont.com can be a great resource. Now, the font I selected works fine for the dates and quote, but the name should be a bit more interesting. While looking at my reference photos, there were a few tombstones with a chunky font in a curved layout at the top, and I think that will work for this design. There's a few ways to do this, but I created a circle path to apply my text to, and then started looking through all of the heavier weighted fonts that I'd acquired until I find one that meets the same requirements as before. Stylistically correct, and bold enough to be easy to carve and read. Then I adjusted the scale of it until it stood out from the rest of the text. Now that I have my two fonts, which as a rule of thumb is the maximum number of fonts I'd use in a design, I can spend a little bit more time on the text spacing. Now generally speaking, I like to keep the spacing even between pieces of text. As you can see, the pink band I've created is equal to the space between the first and second date, and is 2 times the height of the space before you get to the lower text. This is an easy way to make sure that everything looks balanced and also helps to give each piece of text its own room, so that it's not competing with anything else on the tombstone. I'll make the same adjustment for the Van Oak's name at the top, and then I can remove the spacers. One of the most interesting things about tombstones is the symbolism. The addition of small design elements can tell even more of a story, and a great way to add symbols without having to draw them is to use fonts known as wingdings. I'm using this one that looks like an old oak tree leaf, which not only works with the name, but can also mean endurance when applied to a tombstone. Now there's a ton of different wingding fonts, and I've left a short list of some of my favorites in the video description to help you on your way. At this point, I've done a bit of editing to my design. I changed the location of the leaf. I also swapped out English for Latin since I thought that was a bit more interesting. Now I felt like the layout was still missing something, so I thought I'd add a frame to the epitaph. So once again, I found a wingding font that was vintage style frames and found one that I thought was interesting. Of course, you could freehand this design or skip it altogether. This was just something I wanted to test out and ended up finding that it gave my layout a bit more of a vintage feel, which is what I'm always aiming for in our old rundown cemetery. I also decided that I wanted to add a separator line between the dates and the text, so I found another wingding that fit the look and adjusted the spacing of my text until it looked nice and balanced. After staring at the layout for a bit, I decided that the arched Van Oaks would look better as raised letters, so I created a recess to contain the name, and that will get carved out of the foam rather than the letters, much like a lot of the reference images have. This is a design choice that I've used on other tombstones in our cemetery, and I always like how it turns out, so it seemed like a natural choice for this one. The only thing to do now is to see what it would look like on the shape of the tombstone I'd chosen. So I quickly created the outline and could set my design in place to see what I think. Now I like how this looks overall, but I think the frame around the epitaph is a bit busy and doesn't blend well with the tombstone shape. Thankfully, I think the best approach is also the easiest, to just follow the outer shape and really simplify the frame to keep it from being too busy. Now after a quick consult with Mrs. Van Oaks, we decided that the quote didn't have the right sentiment and that the Latin felt a bit out of place. So we did a bit of research and came up with some alternatives for both, and here's where we've landed. Now this may change again, but hopefully this provided some insight into how I approach the creating of epitaphs for tombstones and things to consider when creating your own. So there you have it. Our final tombstone is designed. Now I just need to get to the carving part, but I think I'm going to save that for another video. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.
you.